Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Vision to Value. This is our podcast. I'm here with my colleague, Tony Mathews, and we tackle the toughest challenges in HHS transformation projects. And today we're going to talk about an undervalued component sometimes of success, which is organizational change management, something near and dear to both Tony and my heart. We're calling this the culture shift because when you are working on any kind of a transformation project, as we've talked about before, technology is just a small piece of that, right? And embedding OCM, which we'll talk a little bit more about, has to be part of that transformation before, throughout, and after. Right, so that you can really maximize that success. Last week, just a quick recap, we talked about procurement and how to balance fairness with innovation and competition and all those good things. And so hopefully you got some great value out of that. We're happy that you came back to today's episode. We feel this is something that's really important to all of the stakeholders on a project, and hopefully we can shed some light on how to do this, prioritize it. But Tony, let's start first with just sort of the definition of OCM, just like pure definition, kind of a structured approach to managing the people side of change, right? Ensuring adoption and sustained outcomes. So we talk about a lot in our podcast about return on investment for these projects. And part of that return is the outcomes that you're hoping to achieve in a health and human services organization. If you don't adopt the solution and embrace the change, you're not going to meet those measurable goals. So talk a little bit from your experience, as a leader of an HHS organization in terms of why you come to believe that OCM is so critical and important to organizations.
Ironically, we didn't come to realize the importance of it until we were into it. And so, and I want to level set too when we talk about this podcast. A lot of the things we talk about, sort of maybe best practices or things to consider, it comes from a position of sort of failure sometimes, where we didn't think about OCM initially and came to find out later how important it was. And so as I'm talking about it now, it's easy to say, boy, you got to be thinking about OCM from the very beginning. That doesn't come from some sort of perfectionist type of experience. It comes from trial and error. I think the biggest thing is I've thought about the podcast this past week and getting ready for it. When we talk about change management, change sort of equals disruption, right? And we've talked before about technological changes. You're really not just changing the way you do business, you're transforming the way you do business. And so when you disrupt the way you do business like that, there's a lot of sort of consequences to that you've got to think through right from the beginning. If you do it perfectly, right? And so, it has to do with, the right number of people in the right seats with the right tools. It has to do with communication and making sure that people understand the why we're doing this and how it affects them. It also has to do with sort of making sure that the people that are in positions of authority, a lot of times middle management, they've got it perfected the way they want it, and they're the most resistant to the change. Newer people are more welcoming of it because if there's a better way, let's do it. So I think there's a lot of considerations you have to consider when you're making this kind of a transformative adjustment to how your organization works.
Yeah, for sure. Even when we all know it's the right thing to do, right? And we understand the benefits that we're going to get out of it. Change is hard. Human nature is, that we, even if it's not great, what you know, and, fearing the unknown is not uncommon. So when we think about project success and failure, which is something we talk about a lot, and in this particular case, within the topic of OCM, let's talk about, when someone makes that commitment to OCM, you didn't do it right out of the gate, but at some point you recognized it. How do you establish, what's the criteria for success when embracing OCM and embarking on utilizing this methodology, this approach within your transformation efforts?
Well, I think success goes with sort of, the surveys you do usually once a year on, employee satisfaction and confidence and leadership and how they believe in communication, right? Make sure that the organization's on the right track. That's one way you measure it. I think success is just a successful implementation that improves the service that's being delivered, right, to the customer, the citizen, and that it improves the fulfillment or the job satisfaction of the employee. And I think it's very easy, especially in the health and human services, orbit, to only think about, the citizen as the customer. And I think you're missing a real opportunity to engage and fulfill your staff to sort of make sure that they are getting as much out of the change that you're doing as the end customer is.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're more likely to absorb the change, champion the change, really sort of, jump in with both feet. If they believe in it and they understand why we're doing it and how it's going to improve their lives, it's much easier for them to be on board with the downstream implications and benefits to the customers that we serve.
Yeah.
So I think that's a big part of it is at the end of the day, successful implementation, positive improvement with the customer experience, and do employees feel like this is an improvement in how they do their jobs.
Mm-hmm. Sounds like a lot of culture aspects to that too, right?
Yes.
Like we're all like I come from finance and IT background, and so I'm very process oriented, right? I like to think that I've expanded my thoughts on that over the years, but when we think about change and fear and those sort of things, there's a huge element of culture involved in that. I think it was Richard Branson, right, that said, "You take care of your people, they'll take care of your customers." That's the
Mm-hmm.
same as true in government, right?
Yeah.
So if we know all this to be true, that and I think if you talk to anybody, they're like, yes, OCM's great, we should have that. What are sort of the common pitfalls that some people or organizations encounter when attempting to implement or leverage OCM within the efforts of their transformation project?
I think OCM all starts with communication. If leadership is making these big plans on how the future is going to look and the tools that we're going to use to do our work, and we're not communicating that to the frontline staff, or we are communicating to the program staff, but a lot of times in almost every organization there's a gap between sort of leadership and middle management, and getting the word down to the frontline workers. There's usually some sort of a disconnect there. We worked very hard to bridge that gap and struggled with it, and we were
Yes.
really focused on it. So I think it starts with communication, and that has to be sort of like department wide communication. So everybody, you don't have to worry about something being lost in translation if you're trying to sort of top down it.
Mhm.
It's got to be sort of the organization wide communication. Hey, this is going to be a big year for us. We're getting rid of our legacy system. Everybody's complained that it's slow. You've got to log in 3 different ways. You can put in the same information in 5 different places. We hear you. This is our sort of response to trying to make this work better for you. And, a byproduct of that is it'll work better for the customer. So I think communication is the beginning. I think the other big thing is that's easy to miss really is job descriptions. And I've
Mhm.
talked about this in previous podcasts where, you hired people 15 years ago to help with hard copy applications across a counter. And now we're doing, electronic applications, and you're working from home and you never even see the customer face to face. Those are 2 different jobs.
Yeah.
One is very customer centric and personality and customer service, and the other is more data entry and efficiency and productivity. And so another part I think of change management where you can fail is you sort of evolve your processes and your tools without revising or updating some of your job descriptions
Mhm.
and potentially compensation depending on how severe it is.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think those sort of areas of, for lack of a better word, we'll just say, lack of focus, can result then in some of that resistance and escalate the fear, right? We're not communicating. We haven't thought about the impact of this change on our business processes and therefore our roles and responsibilities. And OCM really can't be treated as an afterthought, right? Like I mentioned earlier, you really need to bring them in early, and they need to be there through the duration. And the other thing I've learned too is, sometimes people will tell you how much they dislike the system that they have, and they just really need something new until you give them something new and they see how different it is, and then they're like, wait a minute, my old system doesn't work that way. And so, just kind of that understanding that it takes time and resources and a little hand holding to some degree along the way to get people to see the what's in it for them, to make sure that they're understanding that value and that we care about them, and that's all really important. And so incorporating that in your budget, in your timeline, et cetera, is really, really important. But another thing I've seen happen too is, when you get to a certain point in the project and maybe you've had a couple change orders because, those things arise that we'll talk about in a different podcast. The first thing that everybody seems to want to cut is OCM. And, I've worked on some of these projects in the past where at the beginning it was all, everybody was on board with things like human-centered design and OCM and, all these other things. And as soon as the budget got tight in terms of development, that's the first place they cut. And then they wonder at the end, why do people not see this tool as so valuable to them? And, so those are sort of some areas where, think long and hard, I think, before you start deciding to cut something as important as OCM if you want your system to be implemented successfully.
No, that's exactly right. And I've always championed, when I've talked to folks that are trying to get state business or local business, you need strong executive sponsorship. It's got to be institutional. It can't be an individual that's leading it, because then when like you said, the OCM budget gets cut, and now the vision is lost because that was a building block, that was a foundational element of this being successful. But if you've got a leader that sees the value in that understands that and is communicating well and indoctrinating everyone as to why it's important, I think you're more likely to resist that urge to cut OCM.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's sort of a good little segue too, as I think about this. A lot of times when you do difficult things in an organization, especially in state government, the staff have learned that eventually they can wait out leadership, and leadership will turn over, right? So the staff is there for 15, 20, 30 years. The leadership turns over every 3 to 6 years. And they've learned really over time that if they just resist something they don't like long enough, somebody new will come in and will have a different vision, and they dodge the bullet and they don't have to change if they don't want to.
Yeah.
So I think if it's institutional to where all players are on board, the executive leader, all the deputies, all the directors and division heads, and this is what we're doing, right? This is what our team is doing, whether Tony's there or not, or the commissioner's there, or the CIO changes, it doesn't matter. This train's left the station. Then I think there's more willingness to sort of, okay, this is happening. There's no sort of resisting it. And I think you're more likely to be successful. But that's another part of it too. You can't cut the OCM budget, and you can't bail on the important elements of change management when the going gets tough, because you're just hurting yourself down the road.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I did also want to kind of like going back a few minutes to just briefly mention, when we talk about, you were talking about OCM for your staff, we often talk about program staff, but we never talk about our IT staff. And this kind of change in when we're going from a 30-year-old legacy system to a modern platform that's software as a service, that's hosted somewhere else, and we're no longer COBOL programmers, and we're no longer the same kind of help desk people, your IT staff are going to be significantly affected by this. And some of those folks have been there 10, 20, 30 years as well. And that may be their baby that you're throwing out, to get the new pretty baby. OCM is just as important for your IT department as it is for your program.
Yeah, that's a whole nother level of complexity to me, because it's usually a different organization, right? It's a different
Yeah.
group. And it's one thing to change manage the change in your own organization, much
Yeah.
less an an adjacent group that you don't control how they're communicated with, or what their job descriptions are, or their compensation. So that's a great point. Like,
Mhm.
you've got to sort of, I think leadership has to be in sort of lockstep with the IT folks, to make sure
Mhm.
that they understand what you're doing and they're on board with it too. Because
Yeah.
that can be tricky if it exceeds your authority to sort of institute change.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Well, that partnership, right, which we'll talk a little bit more about next week between IT and leadership, is so important. I had kind of pivoting into like advice, right, for agencies. And, one of the things I mentioned earlier is start early with OCM before you bring your, SI on board, and start developing things, like help people to understand that, this is something that you're committed to. And by the way, if you stop doing it somewhere along the way because you lost money or you felt that it's not valuable, and you were upfront telling everybody how important you recognize that this is, that actually has some big impacts on trust and commitment to the project from all of your workers. So, keep that in mind too. Like, if for some reason you do have to abandon this effort, even if it's temporary or whatever, like, you got to communicate that too. I know we said this was really important. We're now faced with this really challenging situation. Here's what we're going to do instead. And the one thing Tony talked about, I think, in our last podcast, or maybe it was just prepping, but embedding OCM in everything you do. Like, I understand if you've hired a vendor to come in and do OCM and it's costing you a lot of money, that's appealing because it's an easy cut. I get that. But if you start to embed OCM into the culture of your organization, and I've seen some states do this well, get a few of your folks trained up, right? We're going to talk in a minute about like tools, frameworks, things you can do. There's actually a science behind this. One of my a CIO I used to work with, he was like, it's all the warm fuzzy stuff. And it's actually not. I mean, kind of, but there is a methodology behind it. But if you can start to get some folks trained up in your organization, embrace it and embed it, then maybe you can do OCM light versus having this heavy effort. You can scale OCM up and down. And so, I would encourage you to, it doesn't have to be all or nothing. Think about how you can do a scaled down version of it rather than cutting it completely.
Well, and I think to that point, I think really effective OCM is kind of invisible. Um, you don't have to label it. You don't have to say we're doing OCM today. Put your stuff down. We're gonna, like, if you embed it in just the way you communicate and the way you structure things, and the people you incorporate into the changes you're making, you can do OCM without it being,
Yeah.
a separate effort altogether.
Mm-hmm. It, I love that when you said that to me in a previous conversation, because one of the sort of kind of informal tenets of OCM is that I can't do OCM to you. I have to do it with you.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important, because you're right. I mean, when we start talking about some of the fancy methodologies and things like that, it can feel like one more thing we have to do.
Mhm.
One more, it's heavy sometimes. And I like the idea of it's just how we do work.
Yeah.
That's just what we do now.
It's part of transformation.
Yeah.
It's not a separate thing. It's like I don't have time for OCM today.
Yeah.
OCM is everywhere in everything. There's no dedicated time for OCM.
Yeah, we're always going to do it. What about some other advice? Like, I mean, you've been on both sides. You've been on the consulting side. You've been on the state side. What other advice, do you have for embedding OCM and transformation?
I think when you talk about it before you start, right? All the things you've got to sort of tee up before, in a perfect world, the things you tee up before you start a big transformational technological effort, you got to realize it affects HR, right? Like we talked about potential job description changes and that sort of thing, compensation, that sort of thing. It involves obviously your communications team, right? It's
Mhm.
people have to understand the why. And I've talked about this before. If people understand why you came to the conclusions you did, they may or may not agree with it, but they're more likely to accept it than
Mhm.
if they don't understand why we made this decision. So I think your communications team has to be part of the conversation. I think there's an element of your legislative liaison team sort of educating sort of more open-minded legislators. Hey, this is what's going on in the department and why. So if you hear any sort of pushback from the union or from somebody, a constituent that's upset that their job description changed without their permission or consent, this is what we're doing and why. I think
Mhm.
that preemptively will prevent some heartburn down the road. And then adjacent agencies, whether it's somebody that you do eligibility with, that you either contract with, or just a sister agency where there's a lot of, adult protective services or children's services that integrates with, human services. Sort of just, at a very high level, have a conversation that, hey, this is what we're doing. So they understand, and there may be some synergies there that you didn't realize existed. There, oh yeah, we just did that 2 years ago. Here are our lessons learned. We
Mhm.
did this and we shouldn't have, or we should have done that and we didn't. So I think you've got to really think about it big picture and be very comprehensive about it going in. And I think you can avoid a lot of landmines if you do it well.
Yeah, that's for sure. I mean, you know, everyone goes into these projects with great intentions, of course, and, very hopeful, we're going to really improve whatever efficiency, outcomes, reduce costs. Um, but the truth is there can be a lot of unintended consequences.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're not exploring what they might be, early on, they can bite you later. And OCM can help you root out those impacts so that you can plan for them.
Well, and I think part of that too is, and why I talk about including HR in this is, with an aging workforce, you have some folks that would rather retire
Hmm.
than learn a new system or be part of it, which is fine,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like
Totally.
manage that turnover though, right? If you
Yeah.
know that's a risk, manage that, right? There may be
Hmm.
people that you just assume move out of the way. Maybe there's a buyout, that, we're going to have fewer people because we'll be more efficient. We can afford to buy out some people that have certain tenure.
Yeah.
Um, and I think to me, the keystone are supervisors. As we went around the state every couple years and sort of talked to people out in the field offices, we learned that we had to meet with sort of the frontline staff separate from the supervisors,
Hmm.
because otherwise you didn't get good feedback
Yeah.
because they don't want to talk in front of their supervisors. And the light bulb moment for us was a lot of times the frontline people were very receptive to change, and
Hmm.
anything that made it better, they were all on board with. It was the supervisors that were like, I'm a supervisor. I finally got everybody doing everything the way I want them to. They have to come to me if there's something they don't understand. They were very resistant to change, which sort of
Hmm.
surprised me.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think another part of that is knowing your organization well enough to know where those sort of obstacles might be, to know
Mhm.
where to focus on turning sort of, obstacles into sort of champions for the change. I think
Yeah.
I think that's critical, because otherwise, you've got certain individuals that could block the whole thing because they have influence,
Mm.
or they're just people look to them for whether this is a good idea or bad idea.
Right.
And if you don't know who those sort of brokers of influence are, you could really spend a lot of time trying to overcome that instead of moving forward with your project.
Yeah, for sure. I had a similar situation with between like caseworkers and families. in a child welfare project where we were sort of proposing that the families could do some of these things on their own. We don't need caseworkers to do them, right? So we can expand the capacity of the workers, empower the families, give them some capabilities to sort of be more involved in their cases, or if it's maybe like a foster parent, right? Licensing stuff and, or sending in receipts or filling out for like, why would you not want that? And it was very surprising to me. Same thing where the workers were like, "Oh, I don't know. I don't think I don't wouldn't want to have to ask them to do that, or maybe they wouldn't be, knowledgeable enough about the tech to do it." And I'm like, we gotta trust that people and engage them, right? Like, let's ask the foster parents what they want, and maybe they would love that and welcome it. And the other thing is, not everyone wants the same thing. And so we
That's right.
have to, it's there, nothing that we do, whether it's with the workers, families, whatever, clients, is a one size fits all. And so we have to counter for, adjust for that as well, right? We're never going to eliminate, for example, a walk in, SNAP office, probably. Maybe we will, maybe not in my career, but, because there's always going to be people that would like to come in and they would like to talk to someone. And, maybe that's good for them. Maybe it's good for them in a lot of ways, or maybe it gives them an opportunity to also, deal with other business while they're out. So accommodating those different needs and being open to, the positive acceptance of change versus shutting it down in some cases.
Yeah, I think the insight you get from talking to frontline staff is so invaluable,
Yeah.
because things that are common sense to you and I, yeah, families are frustrated. It's taken too long to get employment verification back. Let's have them provide it.
Yeah.
Well, and then you find out some people will doctor the document, or our staff are being evaluated on turnaround times, and something's been out there for 5 months because they're waiting to get it back from the family.
Yeah.
And I didn't think about that. I thought
Yeah.
if the family wants the benefit, they'll be incentivized to get
Yeah.
that document back sooner than later, not realizing that some don't, or they
Right.
move. And
Yeah.
so the frontline worker is being penalized for having, slow turnover time
Mhm.
when, turnaround time on applications, when really it was out of their hands, and it's not really fair to judge them on that
Yeah.
or evaluate them on that. So yeah, so once you actually talk to the people that are doing the work, it's amazing how little sort of what you think is common sense. Like, of course, the family's incentivized to provide the document.
Yeah.
And
Right.
then you find out,
Not always.
not always.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's invaluable. You've got to, and that's where the engagement comes in, right? The
Yeah.
communication and the engagement, the listening sessions.
Mhm.
You've got to have that to make sure that you're making informed decisions.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you look like your leadership looks like they're disconnected. The
Mhm.
ivory tower in the Capitol is making decisions without a clue about how it affects us in the front lines.
Yeah. Definitely. The other thing too, I think that's really important for leaders is to recognize that you might not get it all right out of the gate, and so making sure that you're monitoring the impact of your OCM effort, and then being flexible and willing to adjust along the way. If something is not working, maybe you decide we're going to send out a monthly newsletter about our. I've been down this path. We're going to send out a monthly newsletter about our transformation. It's going to be fantastic. Everybody's going to feel well informed and they're going to love it. Nobody opens the newsletter, right? Because they're busy doing their work. And even if they did read it, did they really understand what you said? Or did it create more fear and confusion? So the ability to say, you know what, that is not working. We have a 10% open rate on these newsletters. I'm hearing that people are more concerned than ever. Okay, we're not going to do newsletters. We're going to do something else, or we're going to add something different. Maybe we're going to do a town hall quarterly or a monthly listening sessions. We talk about a lot. So just be willing to adjust and know that it doesn't mean your OCM efforts are a disaster. It just means you need to modify what you're doing.
So I'm trying not to laugh out loud. So we did all of that. right? And so we were having a town hall conversation, and we said, "Hey, we want your feedback. What are we doing right that you want us to continue? What are we, how are we not communicating? What can we do better?" And we had one individual at this one town hall that said, I never know what's going on. I hear from other people. And we said, well, we sent out the newsletter every month. I don't, the newsletter, I'm busy. I've got all these metrics I have to meet. It's just one more doc email to open and have to read. And we said, well, we did the video, we sent out the video, it's 5 minutes or less. So on your lunch break, it's my lunch break. I shouldn't have to spend time watching videos on my lunch break. And, and so we said, what about this town hall? You're here, like we're communicating with you. And it was comical. And other people started, he kind of made the point for us. They're like, look, newsletters, videos, town hall meetings, like we're trying to communicate with you in every way you might want to be communicated with. And if you just don't have time to be communicated with, there's only so much that we can do. But it was one of those rare instances where the person complaining about the lack of communication was actually reinforcing all the things that we were doing to communicate without us having to really do it ourselves. So.
Yeah. It is funny. Like I remember back in the day when I first was in government, and we would just get information memorandums, or policy updates, like emails or pieces of paper, right?
Yeah.
And like you would get them all the time, and you're like, I can't even keep up with it. And no one was like calling me to a meeting or having a town hall, and I would have appreciated it back then when all I got was a piece of paper or whatever, an email.
Well, it's just like people learn differently. Some people, if they see it written down, they learn better. Some people are visual learners.
Yes.
Some people have to actually do it themselves to learn it. And so we realized over trial and error that you had to take the same approach to communication. Some people wanted a newsletter. When they had a minute, they would look at it. If they were busy, they'd put it aside and they'd look at it later. Some people just wanted a 5-minute video. Give me the information. Okay, got it. I can move on with my life. Some people wanted the town hall. And so I think that's a key, is just knowing that people want to be communicated with differently and retain information differently, just like you learn.
Yeah.
And you've got to sort of have to hit all of those depending on the group and how they want to be communicated with.
And you can make it fun. Like I've worked on a couple of projects where it's been really fun. Like we did one in Massachusetts where they used boat signal flags to mean different things, and the champions of change had flags over their cubicles, and you knew who they were, and you could go talk with them if you were having trouble with something. That was a lot of fun, and people really embraced it. And I worked on another project which was a healthcare exchange rollout, and they ended up creating these like cartoon characters, and we had posters everywhere and flyers and contests. And so you can make it fun and interesting too. It doesn't have to be boring.
Well, and a great point about that is you've got to understand the nature of your organization. To some places, the nautical flags, super cheesy. I don't want a flag by my desk, people bothering me as a change agent. I'm busy. Other places, they love that. And you've got to know that it's not one size fits all. This worked in Minnesota and we want to do it here in Nebraska.
Yeah.
Maybe they're more cynical in Nebraska. They don't like that rah-rah stuff.
Right.
But, maybe in Delaware, they love that stuff and it works really well. So I think you just have to have a toolbox to know what are the different sort of tools that you could use to do that sort of thing, and pick the one that you think works for your team.
Yeah, definitely. Well, so I mentioned earlier that next week we're going to be talking about, we're bringing a special guest next week. Should we tell them who it is?
I think it's a tease. We should tease it. We should make him check in next week to see who it is.
Yeah, please come back. So it's a former colleague of Tony's. If you know who that is, you'll know, but is going to join us next week. And we're going to talk about that connection between technology and business. We talked a bunch today, and we do in every episode, about leadership. And, we talked about, what does that mean? Yeah, I'm going to show up at some meetings. I'm championing the project. Tony and I had a really interesting discussion about what does it mean to be a project sponsor. I think there's some different interpretations of that.
Right.
And so next week, we're going to talk about that. And we will talk about, what is that blueprint, the leadership blueprint for transformation? That's what we're going to discuss next
I
week.
like it.
So I'm excited about that one. I'm excited to have a guest so you can see somebody else's face besides just Tony's and mine. But in the meantime, Tony, what are your final takeaways from today, just from an OCM perspective? What would you want to impart on our listeners before we close?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is you need to be thinking about OCM from the beginning. I think the further into a transformative project that you start thinking about it, you're going to be catching up. So I think start early. Bless you. I think the other thing I would say is include a lot of those groups that I talked about, HR, communications, your legislative team. I think include as many of those. There may be implications for OCM that you don't realize yourself until you sort of talk to other people. You realize there's downstream implications. And I think the third thing is don't present yourself as perfect. Sometimes, the people that we lead think that we're supposed to have all the answers. And if we present ourselves in that way, like, hey, there's a problem, we've got a solution, here it is, then you're setting yourself up for failure because things change. You make the best decision you can at the time you have to make it with the information that's available. And sometimes one of those elements changes, right? So I think the other thing about OCM especially is be willing to be, humble and a servant of the people that you lead. And, they're more willing to accept if you change course or if you make a mistake in a direction than if you present yourself as perfect and you've got all the answers. Then, they're laughing at you when you make a mistake, or they lose confidence or trust in your leadership because you presented yourself as perfect and then you made a mistake that either you shouldn't have or you weren't willing to acknowledge. And I think that can hurt you. So I think those are the three big takeaways from today.
Yeah, those are great. And just one final thought for me too is, OCM is not optional. And, a lot of states, they're just not doing it. And so I would leave you with that. Now, how you approach it, there's a variety of ways you can do it. And if you don't want to go put out a very big RFP and hire, an expensive consulting firm to come in, that's okay. There are ways that you can approach it. Light, OCM light, but please think about it. It really is the bridge between technology and outcomes, and it's going to help you with acceptance and with maximizing your investment. So with that, I'll close us out and thank you all for joining us on Vision to Values. Please do subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you can get updates when new episodes come out. We, of course, do promote it on LinkedIn as well. And if you have a story to share about change management, please go to our LinkedIn page and respond or drop a comment on the YouTube page. We want to make it a dialogue, and we're very honored that you spent your time with us today. And hopefully we'll see you next week or 2 weeks when we come out with our leadership blueprint for transformation. I think you're going to love it. So thanks, Tony, and thanks everyone for joining. Take care.